Toppmeyer joins us. He is the USA Today SEC columnist, the down and dirty at 30. Usually a lot of news. We'll just go Blake instead because there's a lot to talk about. Hey, Blake, thanks for making the time, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on here, Dave.
Yeah, it's first of all, you and I have crossed paths a couple of times, but really wanted to tell you that enjoy your work, fantastic stuff, love what you do, and tell us where people can follow you. And I do want to discuss your latest column, but where can people follow you on the worldwide interweb?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at @btoppmeyer, and you can find my work really throughout the USA Today network. So here locally, you can find it in the Knoxville News Sentinel. If you're in Nashville, that's the Tennessean, or over at the mothership at USA Today. Really, any newspaper owned by the USA Today network throughout the South.
Yep, check it out. They were still doing the printed version, but for those of you that are on digital, check out Blake. He's fantastic, and also the podcast too that you do with some guy named John.
That's right. Yeah, SEC Football Unfiltered is our podcast. We drop new episodes in the middle of every week. Got our latest episode up now, and actually, our lead segment on this week's podcast is taking a look at this Alabama-Tennessee rivalry. So we try to have some fun on there every week. At the end of the podcast, we usually make 5 or 6 picks against the spread, and the race is on right now between me and John. We're both terrible picking against the spread so far, but he's got a 1-game lead on me, so the race for futility is on.
Well, the three of us should work together then, because I'm absolutely horrible against the spread or predicting games. Sometimes when you get too close to it, I don't know about you, but I overanalyze it. I start thinking about the backup left guard and what if the starter goes down. I don't know about you, but I get too close to it and overthink it.
I just think people think like, oh, he covers sports. He must have a insight on whether this team's going to cover the spread or not. It's like not really. Like that's why those handicappers set the lines that they do. I mean, I don't know if there's any real advantage to doing this for a living versus some guy on a street corner. Like I think your guess is as good as mine when it comes to picking games. But I don't know. That's why they got those big casinos.
That's exactly right. All right, so I want to get to the Tennessee Alabama game, but first, a very cryptic tweet I thought by Lane Kiffin. I don't know if you saw that or not, but it's a tweet of him in the night I was there, the night that he left Knoxville, and I actually was at the very viewpoint in which somebody took a picture. I believe it may have been Amy Smotherman with the Knoxville News Sentinel, but nevertheless, and he's sitting there getting ready to go in his little impromptu press conference. Why would he tweet that out this morning before we get to the Tennessee-Alabama game?
Lane loves flirting with Tennessee fans. He absolutely does. I mean, he likes being, I think, the one who got away. If that's the way you look at him, I think there was a time where Tennessee fans, at least a lot of Tennessee fans, did look at Lane as the one that got away. But even though Vols fans are comfortable and happy with Josh Heupel now, I don't know. He just he likes to have fun with Vols fans. I think he thinks. Maybe not during a game week in a season, but I think Lane thinks a fair bit about his time at Tennessee, his exit. I don't know if he would say he regrets it because at the time, he always wanted to coach USC. He had worked under Pete Carroll. He'd been part of Pete Carroll's dynasty, and I think for him that was the quote unquote dream job. So I think he thought it was something he had to do. But I do think he looks back on it from time to time now and thinks, oh, maybe I could have just stayed there at Tennessee and what might have been. I think he's happy at Ole Miss. I do. He's doing a great job down there. But yeah, he just continually likes to flirt with Tennessee fans. I mean, it's kind of needling them, but really, I mean, he doesn't ever downgrade Tennessee. I mean, he always talks highly of Vols fans. I think he just kind of likes to be on the periphery as, like I said, the one who got away.
I have a theory that he would tweet that out because I think he's pretty open. I don't think he's as orchestrated as maybe some think. And I think he tweets that out perhaps to have fun, but also I think there's part of him that says at Ole Miss you're probably not going to be a part of games like this very often. I don't think the support is as there as it is at a Tennessee or Alabama. Am I reading too much into that, Blake?
Yeah, I don't know if it's because he's at Ole Miss. I think he could be tweeting this out if he's coaching at LSU or whatever. I mean, I think part of this is just Lane. Now, if he's at LSU or something like that, the administration might say, "Hey, Lane, you need to stop tweeting stuff like this." But at Ole Miss, I mean, Lane's going to do what he wants. Nobody's going to be telling Lane how to run his Twitter account because it's not the same degree as FAU, but Lane on Twitter really started to take a life of its own whenever he was at FAU, right? But he was doing it intentionally, and the school wanted him to be doing that because they wanted attention for FAU, a school that nobody would have otherwise really paid attention to. And then Lane gets there, he has a couple good seasons, he develops the Twitter persona, enrollment starts increasing at FAU, the whole bit. And I think at Ole Miss, it's not to the same degree, but Ole Miss is not historically one of the big dogs in the SEC. I know if you go back far enough, Ole Miss had a really good program, but that's not really the modern era. And so I think some of this stuff still is much like at FAU. It's to attract attention. And when you think about the amount of attention Lane gets versus other coaches, I mean, really, I would say he gets more attention, more headlines dedicated to him and his program than maybe anybody besides Nick Saban. I mean, how often do you see like Lane in a headline? It's constant because people know he moves the needle. He does move the needle. And I think Lane says, hey, that's good for me. That's good for Ole Miss football, etc. So I don't know. I don't know if it's just because there aren't as the atmosphere at Ole Miss like there is for Alabama, Tennessee. I kind of think he'd probably do it anyway.
Yeah, probably. Okay, let's talk Tennessee, Alabama. I had visited with John Adams yesterday, and that podcast is on our YouTube page. Check that out. Love visiting with John, brought to you by Files Automotive Group and also Big Orange Phillies. Great place to watch the game at Big Orange Phillies this weekend. If you're not going, I'd highly recommend it there in North Knoxville, Maynardville Pike. But John and I were talking, and I'm not a prediction guy like we were talking earlier. I just kind of roll with it and try to analyze the game. But I'm talking to John, and about halfway through it, I said, "It sounds like you're going to pick Tennessee." And he goes, "Yeah, I am." And he did. And John is known as the most anti-homer, I would think, in the history of Tennessee football coverage. Um, and there is this push, not just John, that Tennessee is going to beat Alabama despite being a touchdown plus favorite. What are your thoughts on this groundswell of people, both nationally and locally, that think that Tennessee is going to win this game?
I think if you're living in the moment, it's not surprising. Like I was in Tuscaloosa last weekend for Texas A&M Alabama, and Alabama was fortunate to win that game. 4 turnovers, three turnovers by their backup quarterback turned starter and Jalen Milroe, and they're literally 2 yards. A&M's 2 yards from the end zone when the game ends. Alabama was that close to losing that game, and then you throw in what happened in Austin, Texas in week 2. They need the field goal at the end to win that game. After Bryce Young left with injury against Arkansas, that became a 1-touchdown game in the fourth quarter. Like final score, it looks comfortable, but that was a tight game in the fourth quarter. So, it's not just one game for Alabama at this point. They've looked vulnerable a couple times, and then you throw in what Tennessee did at LSU. I mean, it was just an absolute dismantling of the Tigers, and the Vols took over Tiger Stadium there in the second half after taking over LSU on the field right from the beginning. So, I think if you've been watching these teams play the last couple weeks, I think it's fair to say Tennessee looks like the better team, especially last week, right? I mean, if Tennessee was the team in Tuscaloosa last Saturday, Alabama would have a loss today. They don't beat Tennessee with the way they played last week with 4 turnovers. Tennessee wins that game. Does that matter for Saturday? Probably not. If Bryce Young plays, that makes a difference. Obviously, Alabama may not turn the ball over again 4 times, but yeah, I mean, I think if just based on recent performance, I don't think it's crazy to be picking Tennessee in this game. Now, if
Yeah,
you think about history and what Nick Saban has done the last 15 meetings, that's maybe where it starts to get crazy. But I don't know. I don't think about history so much in matchups like this. I think because the team's taking the field, like they're not necessarily going to be thinking about history.
no, I think you're right, and I think there is an incredible amount of optimism and self confidence with this team. I had somebody ask me a couple weeks ago. They said, "Is this team overly confident?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "But it may not hurt them against LSU, but I believe it could hurt them against Alabama." I'm quick to say when I made a mistake. I think the confidence heading into this game is what makes it a potential upset. And I'm curious what you think of that and what you think of the 7.5 point spread in general.
Yeah, I don't. I wouldn't say they're overconfident. I think their attitude is probably right where it needs to be. In that, I don't think this team feels intimidated by anybody, and really, nor should they. Particularly when they're going to be out there on their home field. I mean, this is going to be a raucous environment. I don't need to tell Tennessee fans that they know. But I think that gives you a little extra wind in your sails. When you're going up against Alabama, which is ranked number one in one of the two main polls and undefeated, and everything that comes with that. I think taking the field in front of 101,000 of Tennessee fans gives you a little extra pep. But as far as the spread, I guess that tells me odds makers think Bryce Young is going to play. I
Mm.
suppose. Um, it's what I think. I think Bryce Young's going to play. I don't know that he's going to play at 100%, but I guess I'm leaning toward Bryce Young's going to play. I don't think you would see, Tennessee as a 7.5 point underdog if they knew Jalen Milroe was going to play. But also, like every single week, I think when the Bama spread drops, it's always a little bit bigger than I would expect, like just thinking in terms of a general game. But week after week, the Bama spread drops, and they're always favored by a little more than I would expect. But you know what? Historically, since Nick Saban's been there, they have a pretty good record in covering the spread. And you see these whopper spreads sometimes. Now, this one is an example of that. Is not an example of that, but even when they have these huge spreads, a lot of times Alabama covers. But in general, yeah, I would say my main thought on that is I think the folks setting the lines expect Bryce Young to play.
It's funny you say that because I know somebody that's extremely close to the Alabama program, and he said, "I'm not reporting anything, just so you know, so that I didn't run with it." He said, "But I'm just saying that I think he's going to play." So I think he will play. I think it's just a pain tolerance issue. So if you were to set the line, if I made you a bookie out in Vegas, and you've got the big gold chains, your shirt's half unbuttoned down, you've got all this going on, where would you set the line, knowing Bryce Young is going to play, and where would you set the line, knowing that he is not going to play? And I'm usually not an odds line guy, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious what you would think.
I mean, if I knew he was going to play, but no, he's not 100%, because I think it's unlikely that all of a sudden he's going to be 100% by Saturday, right? So let's say he plays but isn't 100%. I think I'd set it somewhere around where it is now, like 7.5, 8 points, probably. Um, if I knew he wasn't going to play, Alabama maybe 3.5, 4 point favorite, I would say. I mean, I think if he doesn't play, I think Tennessee wins this game. But just setting a line, you got to kind of take out what you personally think is going to happen in the game. In terms of setting a line, I think if I knew he wasn't going to play, I'd say 3.5, 4 points. Bama's still favored.
One of the things that's interesting to me is, over recent history, we always say two groups have been really, really good for Alabama, and that's the wide receivers and the defensive backs. So if you don't do the research, you go into this game saying, "Oh, they're just naturally good there," but they're really not elite at all. They're above average. Your thoughts on those two position groups?
Yeah, particularly wide receiver. It's not what we've seen really throughout Saban's tenure at wide receiver, because if you think about Alabama quarterbacks, that really started to pick up the last 6, 7 years. when Jalen Hurts came along, and then you had Tua, Mac, and Bryce Young. But wide receivers, even before Alabama was getting these elite quarterbacks, they always had at least like one really good wide receiver. And then it started to pick up, and they'd have like two or three awesome wide receivers. This year, that's not the case. I mean, they've had a lot of drops. They don't have that 1,000-yard type receiver. They don't have two of them. That's for sure. I mean, really, I think one of their biggest threats in the passing game is Jahmyr Gibbs, their running back. So think about that. Like one of the biggest guys you got to honor in Alabama's passing game is their running back. I think Cameron Latu, their tight end, is also one of their best targets you got to watch in the passing game. But again, when you start talking about running backs and a tight end being like some of the top threats in the passing game, that's clearly not typical Alabama. There's no Devontae Smith, there's no Jerry Jeudy, there's no that type of target that we're used to Alabama having. I would put their back end of their defense ahead of where I put their wide receivers. I agree with you. It's maybe not as elite as usual. I still think this Alabama secondary, though, is really good. I don't know if I'd use the word elite like you normally would with an Alabama secondary, but I'd say really good. Their wide receiver group, I'd call it average, frankly.
And really not even comparable to Tennessee's, which
No,
is
Tennessee has, they're better at wide receiver than Alabama is.
yeah, and it's not even close. So, a couple of keys that you'll be watching in this game, as far as a potential upset by Tennessee, which is obviously what a lot of people are predicting, but still has to happen. What are some things that have to happen for the Vols to beat Alabama?
Well, the most dangerous thing about Alabama, particularly if you take Bryce Young out of the equation, the most dangerous thing about Alabama is its pass rush. I mean, Will Anderson is phenomenal. I'm a Heisman voter. He was atop my Heisman ballot last year because I thought he was the best player in college football last year. And this year, he's still very destructive. I mean, if you watch that game against Texas A&M last week, he was just harassing Haynes King throughout the entire game. Didn't get that many sacks, but sometimes sacks don't tell the full story. I mean, he was landing hit after hit on Haynes King. He was pressuring passes the whole bit, and it's not just him. I mean, he's the big dog, but you got Dallas Turner, you got Chris Braswell. I mean, they just have all kinds of pass rushers. However, Hendon Hooker and this offense are very effective at getting the ball out quickly. That's one thing Josh Heupel's offense is designed to do. It's not the old five-step drop, have a cup of coffee, hang out in the pocket forever, and then absorb a crushing hit. That was the offense pre Josh Heupel. This system is, people think about the tempo of this offense like between plays, and it is very up tempo between plays, obviously. But even after the ball is snapped, everything stays high tempo. And Hendon Hooker's really good at making quick, effective decisions and unloading the ball quickly. But so that to me is an interesting thing. How effective is that Alabama pass rush going to be? Can Tennessee neutralize that at all? And then the other thing I think about is, can Tennessee get the run game going? Because that, the run game looks so good against LSU, and obviously that's one of the best ways to slow down a pass rush is by handing the ball off and running up the middle. Kind of gives those guys pause a little bit coming off the edge. So I know that's kind of the same side of the ball, but those are probably two of the biggest things I'm looking at is how does Tennessee counter the pass rush, and can they get the run game going like they did against LSU?
Let me flip it on the other side. We could use all kinds of adjectives to describe Tennessee secondary. None of them would be great. So up front, they have got to get pressure, in my opinion, like they did against LSU, or it's going to be a long day, especially if Bryce Young plays.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? And one thing I wrote about in a column this week, like Tennessee's weakness, as you said it, is pass coverage. That's right. But without Bryce Young in the game, Alabama's biggest weakness is passing. So they're not without Bryce Young, they're not poised really on paper to take advantage of what Tennessee's biggest weakness is. But I agree. You have to get pass rush, and I think that's every week. I don't think that's just when they're playing Alabama because the coverage is suspect enough that you got to help those guys out. You got to level the playing field a little bit by getting to the quarterback. We saw that happen against LSU. I think it's going to be a bigger challenge against Alabama. I wouldn't say this is Nick Saban's best offensive line. He's had better units. It's a solid offensive line. It's a better offensive line than LSU. That LSU offensive line has been a wart for that program since their national championship season. Frankly, it's the third year in a row where offensive line and pass protection has been an issue for LSU. So it's going to be a bigger challenge getting the quarterback, but I think Tennessee's done a pretty effective job at that throughout the season. And really, we think about this defense, being kind of an anchor for this team. I don't think the defense for the most part has been as bad as we think. We have to factor in the tempo and how many plays are played in a game. And Tennessee's overall defense, I would say, has been more average than bad. But I think the front six has been pretty good. We normally call it the front seven, right? But anymore in college football, you're playing 5 DBs. So I refuse to call it the front seven anymore. It's the front six. I think that part of Tennessee's defense has been okay. It's the back end, and as you said, you have to mask some of the deficiencies there in the back end with that pass rush.
So, do you want to throw your prediction out, or do you save that for your column on Friday? Or
No, sure, we can throw it out. I mean, yeah, it's like I'll have to have two predictions, right? If Bryce Young doesn't play, and if he does play, is that cheating?
I can
I don't know.
we can go that way.
Okay, it's your show, right? We do whatever you want. Okay, let's say Bryce Young doesn't play. I'll take Vols 34-28. Let's say Bryce Young does play. I've just seen it too many times. In my current position, I've covered Alabama quite a bit in the last year and a half. How many times do you see it? Alabama's on the ropes. Bryce Young puts on the cape, and he just refuses to let the team lose. I mean, other than the national championship last year where he wasn't able to bail Alabama out of that jam, time and again, he's bailed Alabama after one jam after another. And so I kind of see him as like the magic man that papers over the cracks. And I feel like if he plays on Saturday, he's going to do something that Bryce Young does. And late in that game, he's going to pull it out for Alabama. So if he plays, I'd kind of turn it on its head a little bit and say Alabama wins 37-34.
It's interesting to me you still have them both close.
Yeah, I have Tennessee covering the spread regardless of which quarterback plays.
Yeah, and Bryce Young is that type of guy. He's kind of like Michael Jordan to the Utah Jazz. We would remember the Utah Jazz a lot differently had it not been for a couple of those series. I'm dating myself, Blake, but again, fantastic stuff. People can follow you on the Twitter at B Toppmeyer, Toppmeyer. You probably already know who he is, but if you haven't had an opportunity to read his stuff, it is very good. Blake, thanks for the time, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Dave.